There is a tree that produces more food than an acre of wheat. A single planting feeds a family for 50 years. It requires no fertilizer, no irrigation, no annual replanting. One tree yields 200 pounds of starchy, protein-rich fruit every season. For 3,000 years, it eliminated famine across an entire ocean. Then empires discovered it. They saw a tree that could feed slaves without cost, a tree that could make human beings self-sufficient, independent, free. That was the problem. A food source that ends hunger also ends dependency. And dependency is how empires profit. So they took it. They transported it across oceans to feed the enslaved. They triggered the most famous mutiny in naval history trying to move it. And then, when it threatened to make the wrong people too independent, they let it fade from memory. This is the story of the tree that solved hunger everywhere it grew, and why you have almost certainly never eaten it. Welcome to Traditional Harvest. Before we begin, if these stories matter to you, the best way to preserve this wisdom is simple. Subscribe, hit the bell, and share these harvests with those who need to remember what we forgot. The story opens in the volcanic islands of Polynesia 3,000 years before European ships crossed the horizon. The first Pacific navigators carried something precious in their canoes. Not gold, not weapons. Cuttings from a tree they called ulu, the breadfruit, Artocarpus altilis, a member of the mulberry family that grows 60 feet tall with leaves the size of a man's torso. The fruit hangs in clusters, round and green, covered in hexagonal patterns like armored spheres. Inside is dense, starchy flesh that when cooked tastes like fresh bread. Hence the name. The Polynesians understood something we have forgotten. Annual crops create annual vulnerability. Every harvest is a gamble against drought, flood, pest, and disease. But a tree that fruits for decades creates generational security. Plant once, harvest forever. The breadfruit was their answer to chaos. From Samoa to Tahiti, from Fiji to Hawaii, breadfruit became the foundation of civilization. One tree produced enough calories to sustain a person for an entire year. A small grove fed a village. Archaeological evidence shows Pacific societies grew so food secure that they had time for art, navigation, astronomy, and architecture that still astounds researchers today. They were not scrambling for survival. The breadfruit had already solved that problem. In Hawaiian tradition, the breadfruit was born from sacrifice. The god Ku buried himself in the earth during a famine to save his family. From his body grew the first breadfruit tree. The fruit was his flesh, given so others might live. They called it ulu, and it was sacred. 1 cup of breadfruit contains 227 calories, dense and sustaining. It provides 60 grams of carbohydrates, not simple sugars, but complex starches that release energy slowly. It contains 2.4 grams of protein, unusual for a fruit. It delivers potassium at 1,080 milligrams per cup, more than twice that of a banana. It provides vitamin C, thiamine, magnesium, and fiber. The glycemic index is low. People with diabetes in modern studies showed improved blood sugar control after switching to breadfruit-based diets. Pacific Islanders eating traditional diets had virtually no diabetes. When they switched to imported wheat and rice, diabetes exploded. The breadfruit was not just food, it was medicine, material, and meaning. The wood-built canoes, the sap-sealed hulls, the leaves-wrapped food for cooking, the male flowers, dried, repelled insects. Every part served a purpose. Nothing was wasted. And the tree itself was nearly indestructible. It tolerated poor soil. It survived storms that flattened other crops. It fruited through droughts that killed annuals. It required no weeding, no plowing, no constant labor, just patience and harvest. Then, in 1769, a British ship arrived in Tahiti. HMS Endeavour was commanded by Captain James Cook. The naturalist aboard, Joseph Banks, saw the breadfruit and immediately understood its implications. He wrote that a man who planted 10 breadfruit trees would fulfill his duty to his family as completely as a European farmer plowing 40 acres of wheat every year for his entire life. Banks calculated the economics of empire. Britain had colonies in the Caribbean filled with enslaved Africans working sugar plantations. Feeding them was expensive, and imported food cut into profits. But a tree that produces 200 pounds of calorie-dense fruit per year, a tree that requires no labor to maintain, a tree that replants itself through suckers and root shoots, could feed an enslaved population essentially for free. Banks convinced King George III. In 1787, HMS Bounty set sail under Captain William Bligh with a mission to collect breadfruit from Tahiti and transport it to Jamaica. The ship was redesigned specifically for the task, the great cabin converted into a floating greenhouse capable of holding over 1,000 potted breadfruit plants. Bligh reached Tahiti in October 1788. He stayed 5 months, collecting specimens, nurturing them, preparing them for the voyage west. But the delay had consequences. The crew had grown comfortable. They had formed relationships with Tahitian women. They had tasted a life without the brutal hierarchy of British naval discipline. On April 28, 1789, Fletcher Christian led a mutiny. 25 men seized the ship. Bligh and 18 loyalists were cast adrift in a small boat with minimal supplies. The breadfruit plants were thrown overboard. Christian and the mutineers eventually settled on Pitcairn Island, where their descendants live today. The mutiny was not about breadfruit. It was about freedom versus authority. But the breadfruit was the mission that created the conditions. The tree that could end hunger had sparked one of history's most famous rebellions. Bligh survived. He navigated 3,618 miles in an open boat and reached safety. And in 1791, he sailed again. HMS Providence and HMS Assistant carried him back to Tahiti. This time, he succeeded. Over 2,000 breadfruit plants reached Jamaica in 1793. But here is where the story turns bitter. The enslaved people refused to eat breadfruit. For years, they rejected it. It was foreign. It was associated with their captivity, another tool of their oppressors. They preferred the foods they knew, the crops they had secretly cultivated, the traditions that connected them to Africa. Breadfruit was plantation food designed to make their bondage more profitable. Only after emancipation did Caribbean communities slowly adopt breadfruit. Even then, it remained stigmatized. It was poverty food, slave food, food for people who had nothing better. The very efficiency that made it valuable to empire made it shameful to eat. This stigma spread. Breadfruit never entered European cuisine. It never became a commodity crop. It could not be stored or shipped like wheat. It fruited seasonally and spoiled quickly. It did not fit the systems of global trade that demanded preservation, standardization, and control. And there was a deeper problem. Breadfruit made people independent. A family with a few breadfruit trees did not need to buy food, did not need to work for wages to survive, and did not need the plantation, the company store, or the colonial economy. Industrial systems require dependent consumers. Breadfruit creates the opposite. So it remained invisible. While wheat and rice and corn conquered the world, breadfruit stayed in the Pacific, in the Caribbean margins, in the places colonialism had tried to exploit and then forgotten. Agricultural science ignored it. Research funding went to commodity crops that could be patented, processed, and sold globally. The tree that solved hunger could not be monetized at scale. But the hunger it solved never stopped being relevant. Today, the Pacific Islands face a nutrition crisis. Imported processed food has replaced traditional diets. Obesity rates in some islands exceed 50%. Diabetes devastates communities. The breadfruit trees still stand, but younger generations do not know how to prepare them. The knowledge is fading. Meanwhile, climate change is destroying conventional agriculture. Droughts intensify. Growing seasons shift. Crops bred for stability face conditions they cannot survive. Researchers are finally remembering what Pacific navigators knew 3,000 years ago. Perennial tree crops survive what annuals cannot. The Breadfruit Institute in Hawaii now works to revive this forgotten food. They have identified more than 100 varieties, each adapted to different conditions. Some resist disease, some tolerate drought, some fruit year-round. They are distributing trees across the tropics, teaching cultivation, and developing processing methods to extend shelf life. Studies show breadfruit flour can substitute for wheat in bread, pasta, and baked goods. It is gluten-free. It has a lower glycemic index. It requires no annual planting, no industrial agriculture, and no dependency on seed companies or chemical inputs. One tree can produce for 50 to 100 years. The potential is staggering. An acre of breadfruit trees produces 2.5 times more carbohydrates than an acre of wheat, with less labor, with no replanting, and with no fertilizer on mature trees. A community that plants breadfruit creates food security for generations. But industrial food systems have no place for this. They cannot profit from a tree that feeds families for free. They cannot patent a crop cultivated for 3 millennia. They cannot create dependency when one planting removes the need to buy. So breadfruit remains obscure. Most Americans have never seen one. Most Europeans could not identify the fruit. The tree that ended famine across the largest ocean on Earth is virtually unknown to the people most desperately seeking food solutions. The pattern repeats. Crops that enable independence are erased. Breadfruit joins sunchoke, chufa, amaranth, and dozens of other foods that solved hunger too well to be tolerated. Not because they failed, because they succeeded without chains. Breadfruit is still waiting in Hawaii, in Jamaica, in Samoa, in the Philippines. The trees still fruit. The knowledge still survives among elders who remember when Ulu was the center of life. Climate projections show the tropics will need resilient crops within decades. Breadfruit evolved for exactly these conditions: heat, humidity, unpredictable storms. It was built for the chaos that is coming. Captain Bligh risked his life twice to transport this tree. Fletcher Christian mutinied rather than leave Tahiti. Enslaved Africans rejected it as a symbol of their oppression. Pacific Islanders worshipped it as the body of a god who died so others could live. One tree, so many stories, all pointing to the same truth. A food source that ends hunger threatens every system built on scarcity. We did not forget breadfruit by accident. We forgot it because remembering would reveal that hunger is a choice, that abundance grows on trees, that 3,000 years of Pacific civilization proved famine is solvable. But forgetting is not permanent. The trees are still standing. The fruit still falls. The knowledge survives in every elder who teaches a grandchild to harvest ulu, in every researcher propagating new varieties, in every community rediscovering that food security grows from the ground, not from corporate supply chains. Breadfruit asks nothing. It only gives for 50 years, for 100 years. Fruit after fruit, season after season, generation after generation. All it requires is someone willing to plant it, someone willing to wait, someone willing to remember what empires wanted us to forget. Hunger was solved. It was solved 3,000 years ago on volcanic islands in the middle of the Pacific. The solution is still alive, still fruiting, still waiting for the world to remember. If this harvest meant something to you, subscribe to Traditional Harvest and hit the bell. Every like and every share preserves what they tried to erase. The next harvest is coming soon.